house on 112 Elm Street stood like a sentinel at the end of the cul-de-sac, its silhouette cutting a jagged line against the stormy night sky. Its windows, dark and hollow, seemed to stare out at the street like empty eyes, daring anyone to come closer, to peer inside, to uncover its secrets. The paint peeled from the walls in thick, curling strips, and the roof sagged in places, as if the house itself were tired, burdened by the weight of what lay within. For years, no one had lived there. The neighbors had stopped asking why, had stopped wondering who would be brave enough or foolish enough to make the old house their home. It was just another haunted place in a town that had seen too much, known too much, kept too many secrets. They knew the stories, the whispers, the tales told in hushed voices around dinner tables and at schoolyards. They knew about the family that had lived there once, a mother, a father, 2 young children, and the things that had happened, the strange events, the mysterious noises, the sudden, inexplicable violence. But the house had been empty for years, long enough that the stories had faded, the memories had dulled, the whispers had quieted. Until now. The Forster family moved in on a rainy afternoon in October. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves, the ground slick with mud, as the movers trudged back and forth, carrying boxes and furniture into the old house. The father, Michael, was tall and stern, his face lined with worry lines that hadn't been there a year ago. His wife, Sarah, smiled brightly, but her eyes betrayed her, flickering nervously to the windows, to the darkened corners, to the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Their son, Alex, a boy of 10, stayed close to his mother's side, his eyes wide, his small hands clinging to her coat. The first few days were uneventful. The house was old, creaky, full of drafts and strange smells, but nothing they couldn't handle, nothing they hadn't expected. They busied themselves with unpacking, with settling in, with making the old house a home. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, whispering among themselves, waiting, wondering. It began on the 4th night. The rain was coming down hard, slamming against the windows, rattling the loose panes, drumming on the roof. Michael was in his study, going over some paperwork, while Sarah and Alex were upstairs, reading in bed. The house was quiet, save for the rain and the occasional groan of the old wood settling. Then there was a noise, a loud, sharp bang, like something heavy being thrown against the wall. Michael jumped, his heart racing, his pen slipping from his fingers. He listened, but heard nothing else, just the rain, the wind. He shook his head, dismissing it as the storm, the wind playing tricks on his mind. But then it happened again. Another bang, louder this time, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Michael stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and rushed out of the study, calling for Sarah. She met him at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, and together they moved through the house, checking each room, finding nothing out of place, nothing broken, nothing that could explain the noise. But then they heard it again, a whisper, soft, indistinct, coming from somewhere deep within the house, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. They paused, holding their breath, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, clearer, words forming, becoming more distinct. It sounded like a child's voice crying, calling out, "Mommy, Daddy?" Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting to Michael's. "It's Alex," she breathed, and they both raced up the stairs to his room. They found him sitting on his bed, wide awake, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room, on the small closet door that stood ajar, a crack of darkness spilling into the room. "Alex?" Sarah whispered, moving to his side, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer, didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the closet, his face pale, his lips parted slightly. "There's someone in there?" he whispered, his voice so low it was almost lost beneath the sound of the rain. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, his skin prickling with unease. He moved towards the closet, his steps slow, deliberate, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and pulled the door open. Nothing, just darkness, the faint scent of mothballs and old wood. He exhaled, laughing nervously, and turned back to his wife and son. "It's empty, Alex," he said, forcing a smile. "See? Nothing there." But Alex shook his head, his eyes still wide, still fixed on the empty closet. "No," he whispered. "He's hiding. He doesn't want you to see him." Sarah felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, her breath catching in her throat. "Who, Alex?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who doesn't want us to see him?" Alex turned to her, his eyes dark, almost black in the dim light. "The man," he said softly. "The man who lives in the walls." The words hung in the air, heavy, thick, filling the room with a cold, creeping dread. Michael and Sarah exchanged a worried glance, and Sarah pulled Alex closer, wrapping her arms around him, trying to soothe him, trying to calm the frantic beating of her own heart. The following nights were worse. The noises grew louder, more frequent. Footsteps echoing through the halls, whispers coming from the walls, the sound of children laughing, crying, running through the rooms. Objects began to move on their own, chairs sliding across the floor, doors slamming shut, lights flickering on and off, and always, always there was the feeling of being watched, of eyes on them in the dark, of something lurking just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. Michael began to wake in the middle of the night, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his skin clammy, covered in sweat. He would hear the whispers, feel the cold touch of fingers on his skin, see the shadows moving, shifting, growing darker, denser. He tried to tell himself it was the house settling, the wind, his imagination. But he knew, deep down, that it was something more. Something malevolent, something that did not want them there. And then, on the 7th night, it happened. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard a loud crash from the living room. She rushed in, her heart racing, and found the room in disarray. The furniture overturned, the pictures on the walls shattered, glass littering the floor. And there, in the middle of the room, stood Alex, his eyes wide, his face blank, his lips moving silently, as if speaking to someone she could not see. "Alex," she shouted, rushing to him, grabbing his arm, pulling him away. He turned to her, his eyes dark, his face expressionless. "He's angry," he whispered. "He doesn't want us here." "Who?" she asked, her voice shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Who doesn't want us here?" "The man," Alex replied, his voice flat, emotionless. "The man in the walls." That night, they fled the house, their hearts pounding, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. They didn't pack, didn't look back, didn't dare to stay a moment longer. They drove through the night, away from the house, away from the street, away from whatever it was that lurked in the shadows, that whispered in the dark, that moved in the walls. But even as they drove, even as they left the house far behind, they could still hear it. Faint, distant, but there. The sound of a child's laughter, the whisper of a voice, a cry in the dark. And they knew, deep down, that the house on 112 Elm Street would never be empty, would never be quiet, would never be free of the things that lived within its walls. The neighbors still whisper about the Forster family, about the things they saw, the things they heard, the things that chased them away. But no one dares to go near the house now. No one dares to listen too closely, to look too deeply, to stay too long. For the man in the walls is still there, waiting, watching, whispering, and he does not want to be alone.